Welcome to this History and Public Policy program seminar on unclear physics, why Iraq and Libya failed to build nuclear weapons, with Professor Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer. Delighted to see so many of you show up for this event. Just a few preliminaries. First of all, I'm Christian Osterman, I direct the program. Happy to have Målfrid here, and along with my colleague Evan Pikalski, who really does the heavy lifting on the logistics and much else, especially on the program's Nuclear Proliferation International History project, a Carnegie Corporation funded initiative that we've run out of the Wilson Center here for the past 7-8 years. The heart of which is a next generation training nuclear history boot camp in the mountains north of Rome. Målfrid is one of the regular faculty members at this boot camp, so we're delighted to have her here for this. She's a partner in the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, NPHP, which in turn is part of a focus, a lane of excellence on nuclear proliferation issues, policy, and history that the center, the Wilson Center, prides itself of. We're the History and Public Policy program has a new blog, Sources and Methods. Målfrid will soon be contributing a blog post, but there are others on recent releases, on access to new evidence, archives, materials on, among other things, nuclear history. And so I invite you to visit our blog, Sources and Methods. If you just put in Google HAP, Sources and Methods, it should take you there. It also has links to our larger digital archive, a treasure trove of some tens of thousands of documents that we've collected over the last 25 years or so here at the Wilson Center on Cold War history, nuclear history, and other policy relevant historical subjects. I think those were the preliminaries. Just left to introduce our featured speaker, Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer. She's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oslo. She was previously a Junior Faculty Fellow at Stanford University, a Doctoral Fellow at Harvard University's Balfour Center. She received her doctoral degree from the London School of Economics, which received the Michael Nicholson Thesis Prize. Her work has been published in numerous outlets, including International Security, Middle East Journal, New York Times, International Herald Tribune, and of course, today she'll be talking about her new book, Unclear Physics, Why Iraq and Libya Failed to Build Nuclear Weapons. Målfrid.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand up because I'm short, so I want all of you to see me, and in case you can't hear me, please just wave and I'll speak up. Thank you so much for those kind words of introduction, and thank you to the Center for inviting me. It's really nice to be back here and talk about the finished product. I've been coming here talking about the work in progress for quite a while, so I'm really delighted to be here and talk about the actual book now that it's out. And thank you, all of you, for coming despite the rain. So the broadest question, I suppose, I address in my book is, why do many dictators fail to acquire nuclear weapons? And why do some do better than others? It isn't difficult these days to say that this is a relevant question, considering the advances of the North Korean nuclear program, nor is it difficult to justify looking at Iraq and Libya, as lessons from these cases are cited in both Pyongyang and Washington and elsewhere. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I could have predicted just how timely these cases are, but I chose to study them because I do believe that they hold important lessons. And today I'll share some of my findings with you, And I look forward to hearing your comments and your questions and to having the discussion after my presentation. So this is a book about two authoritarian leaders who tried and failed to acquire nuclear weapons. And yet these are two distinct outcomes. In 1991, Iraq's nuclear weapons program was interrupted by the Gulf War just as it stood on the threshold of a major breakthrough. And that's not just according to me, that's according to the judgments of the IAEA and many other states. In contrast, Libya's program was dismantled in late 2003 without ever having come close to any kind of major breakthrough, I would say. And so in my book, I ask, why did Iraq's program do so much better when Libya had more time, more access to help from suppliers on the black nuclear markets, and much less interference from other countries in their program? And I make two sets of arguments to explain these outcomes. The first one has to do with demand. I show that neither Saddam nor Gaddafi truly made their nuclear weapons programs their number one priority. And I trace how inconsistent their attention and priority was when it came to these programs. And the second argument is that neither Saddam nor Gaddafi had the institutional resources to carefully audit the progress of these programs, let alone try to micromanage them. And this is really my core argument, which pertains to state capacity. And I argue that, like many other personalist leaders, Saddam and Gaddafi weakened their states to maximize their personal hold on power, and that this had important consequences for their ability, or the ability of their states rather, to plan and launch and oversee complex technical programs such as nuclear weapons programs. But I also argue that Saddam and Gaddafi went about weakening their states in different ways, and that these differences had important consequences. Saddam set out to create a bloated state, a state with competing agencies, competing programs, competing leaders, whereas Gaddafi essentially tried to dismantle the state. He said that his objective was to create a stateless state. And these are two very different approaches. And I argue that Saddam's approach, even though it was problematic, at least gave him a bigger toolbox to try and fix some of the problems that emerged in the program than Gaddafi did. And so even though the Iraqi program had its fair share of problems, they did well enough to come close to success. And I think it's reasonable to say that the Iraqis would have succeeded if Saddam had not invaded Kuwait in 1990. When? Well, we can discuss this, and I'm sure we will in the Q&A, but estimates range from the mid-90s to the late 90s, and that they would have come very, very far in their program. In the Libyan case, I'm going to suggest that any kind of success was a very remote prospect. And so in my book, I talk about these states and I talk about these programs, and I emphasize what I call state capacity, so the professionalism of the state apparatus. And I suggest that state capacity is an important factor to try and understand why the Iraqi program did better than the Libyan one, and that it is a variable that is likely to be important if we look at other authoritarian regimes and their nuclear weapons programs as well. I'm not saying that it's the only thing that matters, but I'm going to show you how I think state capacity influenced the trajectory and the outcomes of these two nuclear weapons programs. And if we look at nuclear history more broadly, we see that authoritarian leaders have been aware of this trade-off between strong state institutions and their own personal control and the performance of their programs. For those of you who are familiar with the Soviet nuclear program, you may recall an exchange between Stalin and Beria where they decide to give the scientists more leeway in order to solve the problems and hopefully succeed with their nuclear weapons program. By that time, Stalin decided that nuclear weapons was his number one problem. And they argued that they could give their scientists more leeway because they could always shoot them later. So I think that there's good reason to look at these different trade-offs that authoritarian leaders make across more cases than the two I'll discuss today. So I'm not just going to talk to you, I'm going to show some pictures as well. Let me say a couple of words about my sources and the research I did for this book. What I wanted to do in this book was to give essentially a bottom-up perspective of these programs. A lot of work on nuclear proliferation focuses on elite perspectives and specifically on decision makers. But I wanted to also look at the perspectives of the scientists and engineers who worked in these programs and to get a sense of what they thought were the main problems and main challenges in their work. And so I set out actually just over a decade ago and did field work in Libya and in other countries across the Middle East. And I was fortunate, I think, with the timing because I was able to talk to scientists, officials, some military officers, journalists, and academics from these programs. And I have to say that spending time in Libya back in 2005 and 2006 really taught me a lot about the Libyan state and Libyan society that I think was invaluable in guiding my own understanding of how this state worked and how it didn't work. And later in the process, I got access to archives. I got access to archives in the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I was fortunate to get documentation from individuals who worked in these programs that helped me to see the contemporary perspectives that both those who worked in these programs had, but also from visiting experts from the IAEA and other countries had on what was happening and what the main challenges were. So this is a picture that shows one of the earliest applications of nuclear science and technology in Iraq. And this is from the IAEA archive, and I was fortunate to be able to use some of the images from this archive in my book. Iraq first began to explore nuclear science in the mid-50s, and they did so with the encouragement of the Baghdad Pact, which set up an institute for nuclear science in Iraq in the mid to late 50s. This wasn't really something that Iraq requested, and the British experts who worked with this, with creating this institute, were quite skeptical that nuclear science had a great future in Iraq at that time. But still, they thought that this was worth doing. Little did they know that Iraq was about to have a revolution and leave the Baghdad Pact and keep the institute. In any case, one of the leading figures in this work was Sir John Cockcroft, a famous British physicist. And when he was in Iraq to oversee this work, he was invited to dinner with the Iraqi Minister for Development, Jaffa, and his family. And one of Jaffar's children, one of his sons, had a conversation with Sir John Cockcroft, and he was asked, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And allegedly, Jafar says that he said, "I want to make an atomic bomb." But first, he had to go to boarding school. And when he returned from boarding school, he returned with a cohort of scientists and engineers from Iraq that had gone abroad to study nuclear science and technology. But things were changing at this point in Iraq, and this was in the mid to late 60s. In 1968, the Baathists seized power in a coup, and they set about making changes in the state apparatus. And the effects of this were felt in the nuclear program. And here you see an image from the early 60s where the Soviets are helping set up a nuclear research reactor, and they and their Iraqi colleagues are checking out the reactor. But by 1968, things were beginning to change, even inside the nuclear program, as a result of these political changes. Specifically, there were some groups among these Iraqi scientists who were supporting the Ba'ath Party. And they began to try and push out some of their colleagues who had refused to join the party. And they were quite successful. In many cases, they made sure that their colleagues left, took other jobs, and some were so fed up that they just left the country. More broadly, the nuclear program at this point in time didn't seem to have a very clear direction. There were weaknesses in terms of the planning, and there were insufficient administrative resources. So scientists were quite free to sort of carve out their own projects. And there's an anecdote from this, again going back to Jaffa, that I think is quite illustrating. Jaffar's secretary was typing up a report, and there was a typo in the heading of the letter. It was supposed to be Department of Nuclear Physics, but it turned out to be Department of Unclear Physics. And this became a popular joke, at least among Jaffa and his nearest colleagues, many of whom said, actually, don't change it. This typo is a perfect description of our program, because this really is Department of Unclear Physics. It's very unclear where we're heading with this project. But this would change, and this is an image from 1974, when Saddam Hussein has gone to Iraq to try and persuade the French to sell him reactors. And I'm sure you will recognize other people in this photo as well. Jacques Chirac was in fact so friendly with both Saddam and the Iraqis that some people called him Jacques Iraq at that time. So he was very happy to sell, well, a lot of different things to the Iraqis, including nuclear technology. At this point in time, Saddam Hussein was becoming more interested in the nuclear program. In 1973, he started to interfere in the management of the program and created a more compartmentalized organization where information wasn't shared as widely. He also instructed his scientists to explore the full fuel cycle, moving in the direction of a nuclear power program. But in fact, he initially requested both a reactor and other technologies that were slightly too ambitious for what really was necessary for the Iraqi program and even the Iraqi power supply at that time. So it was clear that they were exploring technology that could potentially have military applications as well. At this time, other countries began to worry about the direction of the Iraqi project. Was it going for a nuclear weapons option? And if so, how fast? My research suggests that it wasn't at all clear in Iraq where the direction was heading and at what rate. We do know that there were bomb lobbies inside the program, people who wrote reports and recommended a nuclear weapons program to Saddam. I have not seen any evidence that there was a green light given at this point. This was an ambiguous program, and people reached their own conclusions inside the program as to what the future held. And there are other interesting examples from this time that suggest not only that there were different lobbies inside the program, but that these lobbies sent different messages upward in the system to Saddam about what they wanted to do and what they thought Iraq would soon be able to do. And one important example is the research reactor that the Iraqis ended up purchasing from France in the 70s. This reactor was modified so that it wouldn't be suitable for a nuclear weapons program. There were a lot of changes in the fuel and other technical aspects that the French made to make sure that they reduced the risks that this reactor could be used in a weapons program. Still, a lot of states were worried that this wouldn't be enough and that the Iraqis could make changes to the reactor and use it for a weapons program. And this was despite the fact that this would be a safeguarded reactor. Now, my research shows that actually there were different opinions even about this inside the Iraqi nuclear weapons program. And Mahdi Obeidi, in his book and other accounts from the scientists, reflect this. The scientists were trying to calculate, how powerful this reactor would be, and came up with different answers to that. But the bomb lobby inside the Iraqi nuclear program, I think, had oversold what the reactor could do upwards in the system. And there was a meeting just as the reactor was about to arrive, where the main bomb lobbyist, Hashemi, was asking his colleagues how powerful they thought the reactor could be. And his colleagues were careful not to give very clear answers because they thought that the reactor would not be useful for a weapons program. And Hashemi got frustrated and told everyone in the room that his head would be the last one to be chopped off in case the reactor wasn't suitable for the purposes he had in mind. And the irony of this is that the Israelis came in and allegedly saved the necks of Hashemi and his colleagues because they bombed this research reactor in June 1981. And scholars have debated whether this attack removed a route to nuclear weapons for Iraq or not. And this is a long-standing debate, and I've argued that the attack didn't really remove a route to the bomb because the reactor wasn't really suitable. Instead, it triggered an underground and more determined weapons program, adopting different technologies. But it's interesting to know that the Iraqi scientists disagreed amongst themselves, and it's possible that they had given different kinds of messages upwards in the system. And it's even possible that Saddam Hussein believed Hashemi that this reactor was actually suited for a weapons program, and that Saddam may have concluded that Israel's attack actually removed a weapons option that may not have been the case. So here is another image of Saddam with Dr. Jaffa. Dr. Jaffa along with his colleagues, played a very important role in the program. And I think one of the most remarkable episodes came around the time of the Iraq attack, because one of Jaffar's colleagues was put in prison, accused of supporting an outlawed political party. Jaffa stood up for his colleague, and so he too was arrested. And while these two were in prison, they were both asked to help build nuclear weapons by Saddam's brother. Jafar agreed, but he said on one condition: I'm not going back to work before Hashemi gets a different job. And so he had his own conditions for rejoining the program. And after the Israeli attack, Hashemi got a different job, and Jafar got a blank check to set up a nuclear weapons program. Now, there's a lot to say about the Iraqi program during the 1980s, but I will just focus on two key episodes. The first one is in 1985. So at this point, the Iraqis had had a few years to work on their program, and they were struggling in a lot of areas. And at this point, Saddam Hussein appears to have reached out to Jafar and asked for a promise of some kind of deadline, like when can I expect progress? And they called a meeting promising to make progress within 5 years. And this created a lot of commotion inside the Iraqi program, because all of Jafar's colleagues were really skeptical that they could make such a breakthrough within 5 years. But they didn't really tell this to Saddam. Instead, they started to work hard to try and meet this goal. But within 2 years, in 1987, it was clear that they would not make any major breakthroughs along the promised timeline. And Jafar told his colleagues about this, and they were all understandably worried. They didn't tell Saddam that they were delayed. Instead, they reorganized the program and submitted a request to move forward with weaponization. And so that's another interesting example of how, of selective reporting in the case of the Iraqi program. Around the same time, Saddam Hussein appears to have been concerned that there were delays and problems in the nuclear program, but also in the military-industrial complex more generally. And he inserted what he called eyes inside the nuclear program and elsewhere to try and sort of fix some of these problems. But the problem was that these eyes, these intelligence agents, didn't understand nuclear physics, they didn't understand nuclear engineering, and so they didn't know how to vet the program. But by 1988, they couldn't really hide these delays any longer. And the leadership of the nuclear program, the leaders wrote to Saddam saying that they were facing delays, and they blamed another agency for this, which was the Military Industrial Commission. This turned out to be a strategic mistake because the Military Industrial Commission was run by Saddam's son-in-law, Hussein Kamel, who then called a meeting and essentially took over the program. Subsequently, the program split into two tracks. Jaffa oversaw one track and Kamel oversaw the other. Jaffa pursued the EMIS technology that he had been working on for a while and stayed true to Saddam's rule that they had to work with what they could create themselves and not ask for sensitive assistance from other countries. Kamel didn't really care about the rules. He began to pursue foreign assistance with centrifuges, which began to create awareness in other countries that there was something going on in Iraq, at least by the late 1980s. Still, despite these problems, both tracks were beginning to make progress. And by 1990, they were on the threshold of a breakthrough, arguably in both lanes, both EMIS and centrifuges. And so some of the nuclear scientists that I've talked to from Iraq, they blame Saddam for messing up their nuclear weapons program in the sense that if he had not invaded Kuwait, they think that they would have developed nuclear weapons within a few years. Now, the invasion of Kuwait also triggered a crash program, and that's a different story, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. What I will note about it is that the scientists knew that they would not succeed within the given timeline of the crash program. But they didn't tell Hussein Kamel this. Instead, they gave very technical answers that were very difficult for him to interpret, but he took it as a yes, and they proceeded knowing that this was essentially a mission impossible. And now to a very, very different case. It's always difficult to decide which picture of Gaddafi to choose because there are so very many of them. But today I went with this one, which was the style he adopted in his final years, I guess. This picture summarizes my story about the Libyan nuclear program perfectly. This building is from the Libyan Nuclear Research Center in Tajura. And what I find so striking about it is that this is a new building, more or less, yet there's only one light on, and it's this one here. And there are a couple of people outside, but it doesn't look like anyone is inside. And I think that really captures the story of the Libyan nuclear program. It's a story where every initiative starts well, but then falls apart immediately because of the lack of organizational resources. So if you look at the beginning of the Libyan nuclear program in 1969 to 70, the plans were really sound. The plans that the Libyan scientists drew up made sense according to the IAEA, and their goal was nuclear power. Secretly, the Gaddafi regime also harbored nuclear weapons ambitions from the beginning, initially as an offshoot from the nuclear power program. But the Libyan program was soon undercut. In the 1970s, Gaddafi launched a cultural revolution to dismantle the state, more or less. The nuclear program was shielded. Nonetheless, it suffered from several indirect effects because key agencies in the state were undermined by the revolutionary movement of Gaddafi. Another problem was that the regime refused to invest in education. they trained too few engineers and scientists, even though they were repeatedly told they had to do so. And one of the reasons was, I believe, that they were concerned about radicalization, especially among the engineers. And here we see Gaddafi on a shopping spree in Moscow, and this is from 1976, and you can see Brezhnev as well. Gaddafi did well on the shopping front, and the year before this picture was taken, in 1975, he signed a contract with the Russians to buy 2 power reactors. And there is strong evidence to suggest that Gaddafi and his regime believed that those 2 reactors could be a route to a nuclear weapons program. The scientists were more skeptical because they knew safeguards posed a real constraint. But it doesn't seem like Gaddafi asked the scientists what they thought. At the same time, the Libyans were investing in this nuclear research center that you saw in the other picture. And the story of that development also really reflects the fundamental problems of the Libyan program. The research institute was full of new equipment, but a lot of it wasn't even opened. A lot of it was bought in duplicates, and so it was unused. It was sitting there unused. And visiting IAEA experts were despairing at this because they came there to try and launch research projects, and yet the Libyan scientists wouldn't show up. They were working elsewhere because they didn't make enough money in some cases. In other cases, they couldn't make the commute from Tripoli. They thought it was too far. And this is, again, in an authoritarian regime where scientists are just not showing up to work when they don't feel like it. And this led to very interesting correspondence from the visiting experts to the headquarters in Vienna. And the visiting experts are asking for help because no one is turning up to their lectures and courses, and they don't know what to do. And the Vienna experts just writes back suggesting maybe we should stop sending physicists to Libya, maybe we should start sending sociologists instead. And another fascinating episode from the Libyan project comes the following year after this picture was taken in 1977, when the Libyans and the Egyptians are having some border disputes. There were many Egyptians who came to work in the Libyan program, and you would perhaps think that they would be concerned at a time when their country was in conflict with Libya. On the contrary, they went on strike and they got better pay and conditions. So again, life in this authoritarian regime was not necessarily what you would expect, at least not if you were a physicist. So this is a picture of the head of the nuclear establishment in Libya, Eskanji. And he is in Vienna to sign an agreement on safeguards. In the 1980s, this was the time when the Libyan nuclear program was supposed to succeed. The reactors were about to arrive from the Soviet Union, and the regime believed that this would lead them into a nuclear weapons program. And yet nothing like this happened. The agreement with with the Soviets fell apart. The nuclear program failed to even make basic preparations for the site where the reactors were supposed to come, and it all fell apart. And the agency that Eskanji was the head of was disassembled in 1986, when it was clear that the reactors would not come. So really, this was a complete failure. And this happened at a time when Gaddafi was doing even more radical experiments with the state and more or less disassembling the diplomatic service, for example. Now, at the same time as the power program failed, there was a centrifuge development project that was set up in 1981 that turned out to be a complete failure. It lasted for a decade and it produced 0 results. I'm sure many of you have read about the attempt to reboot the Libyan program in the mid-90s with the help of A.Q. Khan and his centrifuges. And if you're familiar with that project, you will have heard of this equipment that was left in shipping crates and that nothing seemed to work, etc. Now, a lot of what happened then was the same sort of problems that happened in the 70s and 80s, where these organizational problems came in the way of the project ever really taking off. In my book, I show that these organizational problems were crucial and that the scientists made good plans, sound projects, but that the organizational problems prevented anything from succeeding. So there's been a tendency to sort of write off the Libyan program as a joke in some cases, and I think that that's wrong. And if you look more closely at the program, you see where the real problem was, and that there were a lot of smart and hardworking scientists who could have taken the program in a different direction if they had not worked in Libya. Okay, so how far was Libya from the bomb in late 2003? Very far, I would say. But I learned something when I interviewed Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, in 2005 that surprised me. He said that the Libyans were convinced that when they gave up the program in 2003, that they were only 5 years away from a nuclear weapons capability. Most people will sort of laugh at that, but I think it's quite possible that some of the senior Libyan decision makers actually believed that this was the case. And that, again, is an example of the kind of information that they receive and the problems they have in vetting that information. So to conclude, I think one important takeaway from this, beyond these two cases, is that Saddam and Gaddafi did not make nuclear weapons their problem number one. Other authoritarian leaders might, and we see one example now in North Korea. And so clearly, just because these two cases failed for different reasons, we shouldn't assume that all authoritarian leaders will fail. And one important indicator is, how do these leaders treat their state institutions? Do they interfere, or do they let their scientists work in the way that they believe is best? Another important point is one that Michael Horowitz made recently. This is old technology by now. And so even if a program isn't perfect, even if a program is suffering from several problems, it can get results over time. Iraq is an example of this, I would argue, and clearly in North Korea we have another example. So I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Målfrid. And now it's time for your questions and comments. If you could please, in Wilson Center tradition, state your name and affiliation if you like, and please wait for the microphone. So we'll start with the gentleman back there.
Thank you very much. This is a brilliant presentation. Perhaps I should introduce myself. I'm the Iraqi ambassador here, and I also am a physicist. And I know some of the people you talked about. And so I have very pointed questions. And as a introduction, I'd say that this is the third talk I go to on this topic. The first was given by a fellow called Jay Davis, who was a nuclear inspector himself. At one point ran the program to look at critical infrastructure in the United States. And he is a bomb maker himself. He came and gave a talk at the physics colloquium at MIT, where I have no love for Saddam Hussein, but I got to tell you, what he said about the accomplishments of Iraqi physicists made me feel very proud. He said that for the first time in history did a country try to enrich fissile material during the 5 different methods that were utilized by the Americans at Los Alamos. Nobody else did. Everybody else who then subsequently got nuclear weapons developed them using centrifuges, as you know. So I have a few very pointed questions for you. Outside of Iraq, the Iraqi government, the Ba'ath Party, was able to construct a very, very deep, well-structured procurement mechanism. Could you tell us something about that? Because this is, I think, important for us, because now we're trying to get back any of the monies that he might have squirreled somewhere away. With the oil prices being what it is, there aren't any small economies. And also, if you could tell us whether anybody has looked at the kind of monies that the Iraqis paid for Osirak, that's the name of the reactor at the time, because I used to be ambassador to France, and a French friend of mine who was in a very good mood after a very good meal, told me, man, we made you pay a lot for this thing. So I'd like to know how much. The other question that I have, and forgive me for asking these questions, as you can tell, I have something I really care about. I think David Kay told me that what had happened was that when the Israelis bombed Iraq, Saddam was ready to denounce the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and to go nuclear. And it was Jaffa who said, you don't need to do that, okay? We can, in fact, develop nuclear weapons in spite of in fact, instrumentalizing, in a sense, the non-proliferation program, and that's what led, after 91, to additional measures and things like that. Is this true? To what degree? Okay. And my final question has to do with Libya. Apparently, there is no there, what you're talking about, But I know that when the Libyans denuclearized, it was a really big deal in the UK. Proof of it, the guy who was in charge of the process got knighted, Was the perception that the nuclear program in Libya, much more than what it was, also the impression in Western countries that it would have allowed them to reach such a conclusion? Thank you and I have a copy of your book, by the way.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for coming, for making time to come here. It would be very interesting for me to talk to you, given your background, and I'm sure that I would learn a lot from talking more to you about all this. To get to your questions, the procurement networks, it's a fascinating part of the Iraqi story, and it isn't something that I focus on greatly in my book. I have an idea of places to look for more information about this, because I know some of the people who worked in this on the Iraqi side. As for where the money is, I'm not sure I'm going to be of great help there, unfortunately. I do write a bit about the funding and the budgeting process when it comes to the nuclear program in the 80s, and it's fascinating how little oversight there was. According to Tariq Aziz, Saddam Hussein and perhaps Hussein Kamal were the only ones who really had a clear, full view, and for certain stages there wasn't even a budgeting process. They just requested what they wanted and got the funding. And I do cite some figures in the book from Iraqi sources outlining how much they spent in different years. And you'll see that this was during the Iran-Iraq War, of course, and the spending just, increased by staggering measures. But a lot of that discounted some of this procurement that you referred to, this foreign procurement. So the full picture, I'm not sure I have the full picture. I have a general sense in the book, but I'm afraid I can't give you very detailed answers to those specific questions. And hopefully others will go and look more into this, because the proliferation networks are an important part of the Iraqi story, definitely. And you mentioned the Iraq attack and the discussion inside Iraq afterwards, whether they should stay within the NPT or not. And this is a fascinating part of the story, I think. And it's my impression that Jaffa was initially arguing that Iraq should leave, because then they would escape the constraints of the NPT, because the NPT had not protected them. I mean, Israel had attacked a safeguarded reactor in a NPT signatory state and got away with it, even though there were protests. I mean, no one punished the Israelis for this, really. But he seemed to have lost that discussion, and they decided to stay within the NPT for a couple of reasons. One reason was that this gave them sort of a cover, and the other reason was that it gave them a platform to criticize the Israelis and their actions. And they did do that repeatedly and got a lot of support from many other countries in this process. The Libya project, you're exactly right. I mean, initially in the UK, and perhaps even more so here in the US, this was described as a major victory and that Saddam was allegedly frightened by what had happened in Iraq, which is an oversimplification, and there's much more to be said about that. But quite soon, the description of the Libyan program began to change, and I think it sort of went too far in the other direction, where scholars and sometimes decision makers basically described it as a joke and that it wouldn't really go anywhere. I too am skeptical that the program would have delivered great results, but it did show just how much could be bought, on the black nuclear market. And also, I've spoken to some American inspectors who went to Libya before the deal was made public to see what was there, and their impression was, I think, a pretty sound one. They said that they got a lot of stuff and they had some very smart people in charge of the program, but there was no bench there. So they didn't have what it took to really scale things up for that reason. And I think administrative resources are a big part of that. So the verdict on the Libyan program has changed over time, and initially it was a very different one than we have today. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
I'm going to stay seated if that's okay. My name is Peter Zimmerman. I'm Emeritus Professor of Science and Security at King's College London and formerly Chief Scientist of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency before it was folded into state. I started looking at the Iraqi program almost immediately after the first Gulf War, and had a lot of insight through friends at the IAEA, friends at our weapons lab, including Jay Davis, by the way. And my colleague then, James Acton, who's now at Carnegie, and I spent a lot of time and money interviewing all three men who at one time or another have written books and claimed to have been the director of the program, Hamza Jafar and Obeidi. I want first to ask you, you say that they were hoping for a breakthrough in a 5-year plan, and I'm not quite sure that I can think of what would have been a breakthrough, nor am I quite sure what you mean by they were on the verge of a breakthrough shortly before the invasion of Kuwait. I do want to challenge a couple of things, not in your book because I haven't bought it yet, but in some of your papers. I think that their use of old technologies, including especially the calutron, the electromagnetic enrichment, was a really good idea because the speed, they were easy to build, and the speed with which a centrifuge program produces separative work units goes up very rapidly with enrichment in the feedstock. Even enriching from 0.7 to 1.4% would make a big difference in the throughput. And OSIROC was not quite as innocent as Dick said it was. It did have bombardment chambers. It did have places to put fertile isotopes, meaning uranium-238 or natural uranium, where small amounts, at least, of plutonium could be produced, and that plutonium would then be useful for equation of state studies so that they could start confidently with a plutonium bomb if they wanted to go that route. But I would appreciate your thoughts on what breakthroughs you think they were on the verge of, and I say that because I didn't see any.
Thank you very much for great questions. Yes, so the very interesting thing for me about this first alleged breakthrough in '85 that they promised but soon turned out they would not be able to deliver was that it wasn't defined what that breakthrough would actually be. And that is, I think, a very telling part of that story, because Jaffa and the others who were present at that meeting, the other commissioners who were present in the meeting with Saddam Hussein, most of them believed that this meant a major breakthrough in production of fissile material. That they, that's what they read into that concept of a breakthrough, but it wasn't specified at any point. And I think it's one of several examples where the scientists and engineers were quite careful in not being too specific about what they had achieved, what they said they would achieve, and when, so that there would always be some room for interpretation. And also, when you look at the reporting they did underway in the program, it's either very, very technical and difficult for any sort of layperson to interpret, or it's kind of confusing or blending what they want to achieve with what has actually been achieved. So that's another very interesting part of the Iraqi program, how goals were defined or not defined and how the reporting was done. But concerning the other breakthrough in 1990 to 91, that was, the progress made in the centrifuges and the EMIS track towards scaling up from sort of initial R&D. And again, it's not just sort of my judgment that they were at a threshold or near a threshold. This is something the IAEA concluded in 97. And again, I think that was a difficult admission for the agency because this was a hugely embarrassing episode for them. And other countries concur with that judgment. So I think it's fair to say that they did make some breakthroughs from 87 onwards. And I very much agree with you that the approach taken in terms of the technologies the Iraqis chose was very sound. I mean, if you consider the circumstances where they had just been attacked by the Israelis, they were expecting to be attacked again. That's certainly what they told each other. They were at war, and they tried to convince the French to sell them another reactor, and France wouldn't do it. So there were a lot of constraints that they were facing, which meant that it made sense to go for these older technologies that the Iraqis were fully aware that they were not cutting edge or economic, or that there were a lot of issues with them, but that wasn't the point. Right, so they wanted something that they could pull off. And when you look at, in some of the sources I cite in my book, you look at their how they weigh the costs and benefit of different options, and I think that is quite telling. And again, I'm grateful that you asked this, because that is one of the issues I have with some of the research done on the Iraqi program, where people say they made, why did they go for these old technologies? They should have gone for something, better. But I think, they did so for a very good reason.
I think they did too. I would say that Jafar let his people play around too damn much with wherever their curiosity led them. He handed me a sheaf of about...
Could you use the microphones?
Jafar handed me a sheaf of about 7 or 8 different designs for their equivalent of Trinity, all of which were wrong, badly wrong, but some of them would have worked reasonably well. And they were just allowed to waste time and money on trying new ideas instead of focusing on what they wanted.
That's a very interesting observation. I just quickly, if I may, add to that. Actually, Jaffa is blamed for some of those problems when, in fact, the sources I have show that he was instructed to keep some of these tracks going and add other ones by his boss. And so Jaffa is sometimes blamed for things that it wasn't really his fault. And I think that's actually an example where he wanted to concentrate certain resources in some areas, and he wasn't, allowed to do that. And I argue that one of the reasons was that the top leaders of the program, they wanted to make it seem like they were doing all this work in all these different areas, and that it kind of disguised some of the problems that they had. If they could point to, look, we're doing this and this and this in all these different areas. But it's an interesting discussion, definitely.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Glen Schweitzer at the National Academy of Sciences. In the late 1990s, one of these leading bomb designers showed up here in Washington. He was a defector. and he spoke out publicly about what went wrong with the program. His comments were sort of tracked with yours in terms of the materials. So the materials, they make the progress similar to what you said. But there's a very famous photograph put out by Sandia, which shows the 700 components you must put in the physics package of the most primitive bomb to make it work. And he was saying, look, where am I going to get those 700 parts in Iraq? You have to have springs, you have the reflectors, you have the connectors, and so forth. It takes me sometimes a year to get one of those. And his argument was, yeah, we have the material, but we're a long, long way for the bomb, and we're not going to get there soon.
Yeah, thank you. They had started working on the weaponization. It wasn't a huge priority, and my interpretation is that they were not really in a rush for the weaponization stuff to be figured out, that they were focusing on getting the centrifuges and EMIS to work first. But you're exactly right. I mean, this was something that became a contentious issue between the nuclear program and the Military Industrial Commission that was, charged with creating some of these very advanced components, and in some cases that was probably too difficult. And so they had to go abroad, presumably to get some of this. And I do recall Jaffa and some of his colleagues saying that all of the secrecy with the program and Saddam's concern that they should try and avoid as much as possible reaching out to foreign suppliers, that this was almost counterproductive, not only with sensitive equipment that would sort of obviously cause attention, which they started going after, but also that they were instructed not to buy even simpler things that would not necessarily create a lot of attention. So from Jaffar's point of view, it would have been better at some point to try and go out and buy more of these pieces. But I think my interpretation, if you look at the weaponization track in the program, it's interesting to note that the initial person who was charged with putting together a report on this was someone that pretty much everyone else in the program made fun of, and they certainly made fun of his proposal that was extremely expensive and they didn't have a lot of faith in it. And so it suggests to me that weaponization wasn't necessarily the first priority of the program. And, when they started working on this sort of later on in the process, I'm sure that they would have faced a lot of challenges. And one of the reasons was that the engineering side of things was not well managed in this program on the whole. I mean, there were exceptions, but that was certainly one of the more challenging aspects.
Yep. Hold on the microphone.
My name is Hadil. I'm from the Iraqi Embassy, Affairs Secretary.
Hold the microphone.
Oh, my name is Hadil. I'm from Iraqi Embassy, Affairs Secretary there. I would like to ask about the UN inspectors. They were sent to Iraq during 90s, especially after the Iraqi invasion to Kuwait. What's your conclusion regarding this matter?
I'm actually writing a book about this, so I will have a lot of conclusions in a few years' time. One conclusion I can, put forward already is that certainly in the nuclear area, the inspectors were quite efficient in mapping most of the program early on and dismantling the program, and that was the end of the Iraqi nuclear weapons program after 1991. But it's a very complicated story with a lot of dimensions. So I think I will have to perhaps come back and talk more about that in a few years' time. Thank you.
Any other questions? Let me perhaps chime in. Since you're here at the home of the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, which is focused on archives and building kind of the empirical database for nuclear history, you referenced some of your sources in your talk. You talked about your field work in Libya and IAEA sources, but it comes through that you clearly have a much broader source base than that. So if you just want to talk a little bit about what some of these insights are based on, especially on these sort of internal discussions within within Iraq. And secondly, even though you're you're onto a slightly different subject, if there are you aware of any? Have you become, since you finished the research on the book, aware of any sort of major archives, document collections, holdings that would be important to preserve, that you would have liked to had for your book, that maybe a joint international effort could go after? What's, both a little bit more about what your conclusions are based on, and then, what's your dream list of what I wish I had access to in writing this book?
Oh, great questions. If I can start with the last question, what I wished I had more access to, I would say documents in Libya. After the events of 2011, it's pretty clear that there were archives in Libya, but that these have been in part destroyed, in part removed, and it's unclear what's happened to those sources. And I think that this is a tragedy for Libya, but it's also a tragedy for historians and those of us who are interested in learning more about the program. Even though I did my best in reconstructing the history of that program based on the few Libyan sources I was able to get, and also the archives of the IAEA, it's clear that there is much more work that could be done for someone with access to Libyan source materials. And this is an area where I really do think that institutions such as the Wilson Center could play a major role, because there are some documents that have been seized by some international organizations focusing on human rights abuses, for example. But it's unclear what they're doing with these sources and if they're sort of preserving them. And I think if there's one thing we can do, it is perhaps to try and collect these and preserve them so that they will be available for Libyans and for other historians, so that we don't risk that the Libyans are robbed of their history. And I fear that this could be happening not only in Libya, but perhaps also in Tunisia and other countries. So I think creating, safeguarding those sources, that is an area that I think is an important one, and it's not clear to me that anyone is actually doing this at the moment. In terms of the sources that I have for Iraq, I cite them in my book, so I can just sort of outline the different kinds of material I have. I interviewed most of the senior figures in the program. I received access to Dr. Jaffar's memoirs, that he wrote, that have been published in Norwegian and Arabic, but not many other languages. So being Norwegian, I also had, I guess, an advantage there. But I've also received access to documents from the Iraqi program, including the declarations that Iraq submitted to the IAEA prior to the war in 2003, and I refer to those documents in the book as well. And I've been extremely fortunate that individuals have been willing to share their private archives and collections with me. That also means that I have a responsibility to sort of honor their requests. In some cases, I can't share beyond. I have to ask these people before I share. But there are other sources that I have that I very much hope to build into a digital archive, and hopefully I know the Wilson Center that you have a lot of resources like that, and hopefully that can be part of a future archive based on some of this material, definitely.
Final question then, or anyone else? Why don't we give this young man over here first a chance, and we'll get back to you. Sure. You have one more? All right.
I'm Jordan Friedman. I'm an undergraduate student at American University School of International Service. Thank you for speaking. So I have two questions. The first of which is, political arguments aside, how serious of a threat were WMDs in the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq? And the second question is, The second Bush administration. The second question is, it's more of an analysis of the future, but given the state of what the JCPOA is and is not for that matter, what do you think the timeline for the development of an Iranian warhead is once the deal expires? Because quite clearly they are not the best tenant in terms of honoring the deal, given that I would argue it's not much of a deal.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Those are very challenging questions, and thank you for asking them. How serious of a threat were the WMD issues in the case for war? Well, that's a very complex question. I mean, because you're asking, you know, what did the actors perceive themselves, and how important was that, the WMD issue in the bigger picture, you know, the rationale for going to war. I'm not an expert on that decision to go to war. I will say, though, that that there were a lot of inspectors that had been in Iraq during the 90s who were very skeptical of the claims that the weapons programs were reconstituted. And I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. David Kelly in the UK, but he was a scientist who was you know, very well informed about these Iraqi programs, who was also very skeptical of some of these hyped up claims. And I think it's fair to say, you know, in light of the Chilcot inquiry in the UK and various inquiries here, that the threat was oversold. Not necessarily that the actors didn't, you know, that leaders like Bush and Blair did not believe that there were programs. It's quite likely that they did believe that there were programs, but still that the information they had was not quite as strong as they suggested that it was. That's one way of getting at your question. On the JCPOA, the timeline for developing some kind of nuclear weapon, well, the claim has been made that the deal makes the timeline longer to about a year, and of course there are different assessments of this, and I can only refer to the different assessments, and I'm not going to try and sort of adjudicate between them. I do think that, you know, the deal asks Iran to make major concessions and that it lengthens that timeline, and I think that there's a lot of reason to be worried about, you know, the signs that the current U.S. administration is adopting some of the rhetoric that was used in 2002 and 2003. So I'm quite worried about the current situation.
Thank you. Let's do a last round of questions before we conclude. I think, Mr. Ambassador, did you have one more question?
Actually, it's more the nature of a comment on Jaffa Jaffa, and it's a personal thing. I met him in 1974, 75. I was a freshman student at a college of engineering, and he was conducting research at CERN. He was a professor at the University of Birmingham at the time. And I told him I was an engineering physics student, and he was dismissive of the title engineer. And I think that actually encapsulates the reason why he was not as successful as he could have been. He was really a researcher, and I think that's one of the reasons why he allowed people to go all over the place in order to pursue their intellectual curiosities rather than development. And I think one of the signatures that one has to look for in future programs, in assessing future programs, are not the scientists, but the engineers. It is of concern because in Iraq, I think during the 1980s, they had a very, very good engineering, military engineering program. I mean, where do you think these IEDs came from? You know, people who were trained during the 1980s, during the 1990s. And in fact, one of the big successes of the Iraqi military industrialization program was to weaponize air fuel explosives, which is not an easy thing to do. I'm pointing this out because this is this is an issue of concern for me. I know that there are institutions that have been known to be quite predictive, like the Office of Net Assessment, who are looking at the potential for the use of nuclear weapons on a tactical level. It's being a real threat because the barriers to development are going down. Maybe the barriers to use are coming down. So whatever, I mean, work like yours, I think, is really to be commended and followed. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. And can I quickly comment on that? I fully agree with your observation about the engineers and their status in the Iraqi program. And in my book, I go into some of the many arguments that Jaffa ended up having with some of his senior colleagues who were engineers, because the engineers wanted to do more testing before they went into production, whereas Jafar said, let's do the upstream and downstream activities simultaneously, which turned out to be very wasteful and very problematic. So I think eventually the engineers actually got a bigger influence in the reorganizations after '87, and that's one of the reasons why the program did better. And I think your observation about this is true of other cases as well. And I think the Pakistani nuclear program is absolutely a similar case where sort of classical physicists or theoretical physicists are put in charge of programs that are really, fundamentally engineering challenges. So I think that's a very important observation. Thank you.
Thank you. Over here.
At the risk of wearing out my welcome, I do have one more comment. We've talked a lot amongst ourselves here about the weaponization program. And I'd like to go back, since you're clearly very involved with history, to the Manhattan Project, which is the prototype of them all. It's worth remembering that 90% of the Manhattan Project budget went into procuring the material, the fissile material. 8% went into weaponization, and shockingly, only 2% into administration.
Those are interesting figures. Thank you.
So when you talk about weaponization, it's not the dog, it's the tail.
And I think that is the approach that the Iraqis took to this as well. Yeah.
All right. Is there one final question then, John? Yeah.
Hi, Målfrid. Great. It's wonderful to hear and see the book in its final form. Jonathan Hunt from the University of Southampton. I was curious because so much of what you're looking at is, as political scientists like yourself term it, sort of a supply-side explanation for nuclear weapons programs. If you were to do a presentation to, say, an intelligence service in the United States or elsewhere about what keys they might look for in an authoritarian regime to determine their state capacity, to determine how likely they were to not only pursue but achieve a nuclear weapons capability, what would you advise them?
Oh, that's a challenging question. I think what I suggest in my book is that we can learn a lot from how authoritarian leaders treat their state institutions, and examples are, do they shield, for example, the nuclear program from broader coups? And that's an example where we see quite important differences. From purges, I mean. That's an area where we see important differences between Iraq and Libya. Another example is, do nuclear scientists and engineers, do they have a higher status than others? And are they, for example, exempted from military service? Again, that's an area where you see differences between Iraq and Libya. And I would look for clues suggesting, do they interfere with the professionalism of different institutions, or do they leave certain agencies to their own devices in order for them to solve the problems they're charged with? So I think that's one set of indicators to look for. Yeah. Thank you.
Steve? Suddenly they're coming out of the woodwork here at the last minute.
Stephen Shore, I hadn't intended to ask a question, but your last point reminded me of the time the Wilson Center showed a film about Kurchatov and the development of the Soviet atomic bomb, and pointed out that a key factor that enabled them to succeed was that Beria convinced Stalin to leave Kurchatov and his team alone and said, if it doesn't work, we can always shoot them afterwards.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, and I think, you know, as I referenced in the beginning, I think authoritarian leaders are well aware that there are important trade-offs between how scientists perform and, you know, the measures that leaders take to control institutions. And also, you know, it's interesting to see that, for example, Saddam Hussein, he overturned some of the efforts done by the Ba'athist groups inside the nuclear program, where they pushed out non-Ba'athist colleagues. Saddam Hussein overturned that and went for a more sort of meritocratic approach and brought the best people back into the program. So there are trade-offs, and I think at certain times leaders are very well aware of which route is the better one to go for.
Great. I thank you all for your insights and comments this afternoon. And of course, we thank Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer for this very stimulating discussion. Thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. Copies of the book are for sale outside for your convenience. Thank you.